She was the woman the whole town laughed at. Large, plain, unwanted. Eleanor Vane had spent 30 years making herself useful so people might forget to be cruel. It never worked. But on the night they humiliated her in front of everyone, in front of the fire, the fiddle music, the faces she had fed and sewn for and smiled at, something happened that no one in Briar Ridge could have predicted. A little girl with grief-hollowed eyes ran across the room, wrapped her arms around Eleanor's waist, and said one word. "Mama." And the man in the doorway decided to make it permanent. If you've ever been underestimated by people who should have known better, stay with me. Drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it moves you, hit that like button before we're done. Chapter 1. The gathering at Harlan Briggs's barn had been going for 2 hours before Eleanor Vane seriously considered leaving. She had told herself she wouldn't come. She'd stood in front of her small mirror that afternoon and rehearsed the same argument she always made. You have work to do. There's a hem on Mrs. Dooley's skirt that won't fix itself. The wind's coming in cold and your joints will ache by morning. Reasonable arguments, sensible arguments, the kind of arguments a woman makes when she already knows what's waiting for her on the other side of the door. But Clara Briggs, Harlan's youngest, not the other Clara, the one with the gap in her front teeth, had personally delivered the invitation and stood on Eleanor's porch with both hands clasped behind her back, like she was reciting a school lesson. "Pa says you gotta come, Miss Eleanor. He says the settlement won't feel right without you." Children didn't know how to lie convincingly yet. That was the thing Eleanor had always loved about them. So she'd pinned her best collar, dark blue wool, nothing fancy, smoothed her hair back as flat as it would go, and walked the quarter-mile through the cold to Harlan's barn with the blueberry preserves she'd been saving since August tucked under her arm. The barn was warm and loud. Someone had strung lanterns along the beams, and they threw a honey-colored light over everything. Over the men playing cards in the corner, over the women gathered near the long tables of food, over the children chasing each other through legs and around barrels with absolutely no regard for human safety. A fiddler near the far wall was going at something lively. 2 couples were attempting to dance in the limited space near the door, laughing when they collided with each other. Eleanor set the preserves on the food table and stood there for a moment, waiting to feel welcome. "You're being foolish," she told herself. "You know these people. You've sewn half their children's winter coats." She did know them. That was in some ways the problem. She moved to the edge of the room and found a spot near the wall where she could be present without being in anyone's way. It was a skill she had developed over years. The art of occupying space so quietly that people could pretend, if they chose to, that she wasn't there. It protected everyone. It protected her. Ruth Alderman found her within 10 minutes, because Ruth always did. Eleanor. Ruth was a narrow woman with a face that could have been kind if she ever let it rest. She had 3 daughters, a prosperous husband, and an apparently unshakable belief that the social order of Briar Ridge required constant maintenance. She smiled with her mouth. "I didn't think you'd come out in this cold." "It's not that cold," Eleanor said. "No, I suppose not." Ruth's eyes moved over Eleanor in that brief, comprehensive way she had. The way that took in the pinned collar, the worn hem, the breadth of Eleanor's shoulders, and arranged all of it into a tidy little verdict. "You look well." She didn't mean it. Eleanor had stopped expecting her to. "Thank you," Eleanor said, because what else was there? Ruth drifted away toward a cluster of women who received her with the kind of warmth that required years of cultivation. Small debts, shared confidences, the mutual understanding that they were all collectively better than certain other women in the settlement. Eleanor watched her go without resentment. She'd used up most of her resentment for Ruth Alderman years ago and found the expenditure not worth the cost. The evening passed. The way these evenings always passed for Eleanor. She helped carry food when it needed carrying. She held babies when mothers needed their hands free. She laughed at jokes when jokes were made, and she listened carefully when people talked, because she was genuinely interested in other people's lives, even when they had no corresponding interest in hers. Old Pete Calloway told her the whole long story about his mule getting loose in October, and she listened to every word of it, including the part about the fence post, which he told twice. She was good at this. Being present without being seen. It was fine. She had made peace with fine a long time ago. The trouble started because of a boy named Thomas Pruitt. Thomas was 8 years old, red-haired, and possessed of the particular kind of boldness that lives in children who haven't yet learned that cruelty has consequences. He was Jeremiah Pruitt's youngest, and Jeremiah was the kind of man who laughed too loud at other people's expense and called it good humor. Thomas had been watching his father his whole life. Eleanor was standing near the water barrel, refilling her cup, when Thomas appeared beside her with two of his friends, small boys with their Sunday shirts already untucked and their faces flushed from running. "My pa says you're so big you block out the sun," Thomas announced. It was said clearly, conversationally, the way a child says something he has heard adults say, testing to see if it's funny when he says it too. The two boys beside him looked at Eleanor with wide eyes, waiting. Eleanor set down the ladle very carefully. The thing was, she had heard worse. She had heard considerably worse. She had heard things said about her that she would not repeat even in the privacy of her own mind, because repeating them gave them a kind of life she refused to allow. She knew she was large. She had known it since she was 9 years old and bigger than every boy in her school, and she had spent decades learning to occupy her body without apology, which was harder than it sounded and took longer than it should have. But Thomas Pruitt said it in Harlan Briggs's barn, in the warm lantern light, and it carried. The fiddler had paused between songs. The women near the food table had gone quiet. The men at the cards had looked up. In the particular acoustic cruelty of a barn gone briefly silent, Thomas Pruitt's words reached every corner. Someone laughed. Not loudly, more of a surprised exhale, the kind that escapes before a person decides whether they want to be the type of person who laughs at that. But once one person laughed, a few more followed, and laughter is a current that pulls people along whether they mean to go or not. Jeremiah Pruitt, from across the barn, was grinning. Eleanor looked at Thomas. He was watching her with a kind of hungry curiosity, waiting to see what she would do. He wasn't even being mean, not really, not in the way that knows itself as mean. He was just a boy who'd heard a thing and repeated it and was now watching to see how the world would respond. That was somehow the worst part. She opened her mouth. She had no idea what she meant to say. Something quiet. Something that would end this without making it worse, without crying, without giving anyone in this room the satisfaction of watching Eleanor Vane break in public. She'd gotten as far as drawing breath when the barn door opened. Cold air rolled in across the hay-strewn floor. The laughter died. Not because anyone decided to stop laughing. It simply stopped, the way a candle goes out when a window opens. The air changed and the sound changed with it. In the doorway stood Gideon Mercer. Eleanor had seen Gideon Mercer exactly 3 times in her life, and each time at a distance. He was not a man who came to gatherings. He was not, by most accounts, a man who came anywhere that had more than 2 or 3 people in it, if he could help it. He lived up in the Iron Hollow, the frozen stretch of highland country north of the settlement where the pines grew so thick they blocked the midday sun, and he came down to Briar Ridge only when he needed supplies or had pelts to trade. He had been coming down less since his wife died. He was tall in the way that made other tall men feel ordinary. His coat was heavy canvas, dark with wear and weather, and his face, what Eleanor could see of it past the beard and the brim of his hat, was the face of a man who spent most of his time outdoors, and none of it worrying about what that did to his appearance. There was a scar along his left jaw that she'd heard about secondhand. He had eyes so dark they looked black from across a room. He was maybe 40, maybe older. It was hard to tell with men like him. The mountain had a way of aging some men prematurely, and others not at all. And Gideon Mercer looked like he had simply arrived at a certain weathered permanence and stayed there. In his arms, pressed against his chest with her face half buried in his coat, was a small girl, Clara, his daughter. Eleanor had never seen her up close, but she knew the story the way everyone in Briar Ridge knew the story, passed around in the careful, lowered voices people used when they talked about grief. Gideon's wife, Mary, her name had been Mary, had died of fever 2 winters back. The girl had been 4 years old. She barely spoke anymore, people said, barely ate. Gideon brought her down to the settlement once or twice looking for someone who might help, and mostly found people who felt sorry for her and didn't know what to do with sorry. The barn had gone the particular kind of quiet that happens when a man with Gideon Mercer's reputation walks into a room. He wasn't looking at the room. He was looking at his daughter. The girl, she must have been 6 now, small even for that, had lifted her face from his coat. She was staring across the barn with dark, serious eyes that took in the crowd without blinking. She had her father's coloring. She had a stillness about her that didn't belong on a child's face. Eleanor didn't know why the girl was looking at her. She registered it distantly, the child's gaze finding her and staying there. But her mind was still caught in the loop of Thomas Pruitt and the laughter and the breath she'd drawn and never used. Then the girl said something to her father, quiet enough that Eleanor couldn't hear it across the room, but she watched the child's lips move and watched Gideon's face shift. Not soften, exactly, but recalibrate, the way a man does when the terrain under his feet turns out to be different from what he expected. He set the girl down. He said something back to her, low and serious. The girl shook her head, and then she walked. She walked across Harlan Briggs's barn with the kind of purposeful, unhurried certainty that small children sometimes have. The certainty of someone who hasn't yet learned to be embarrassed about wanting what they want. She walked past Thomas Pruitt and his friends, and the women by the food table and the men at the cards, and people moved out of her way without quite knowing why, because there was something in her expression that made moving seem like the right thing to do. She stopped in front of Eleanor. Eleanor looked down at her. The girl looked up. She had a small, serious face with a smear of something, pine sap probably, along her left cheek, and her hair had been braided by someone who tried their best and didn't entirely succeed. She was wearing a coat 2 sizes too large and boots with the laces doubled because they were too long. For a moment, she just looked at Eleanor. Then she wrapped both arms around Eleanor's waist, pressed her face against Eleanor's stomach, and held on. Eleanor froze. The barn had not found its voice again. Nobody moved. Somewhere near the back wall, a log shifted in the fire and sent up a small shower of sparks, and the sound of it was enormous in the silence. The girl's arms tightened, and then, muffled against Eleanor's coat in a voice so small it should not have carried, but it did, because the room had never been so quiet in its life. Mama. Eleanor's hand moved before she made any decision about it. It found the top of the girl's head, her fingers settling gently into the uneven braids. She didn't speak. She wasn't capable of speaking. Across the barn, she could feel Gideon Mercer watching. She looked up and found him. He was standing exactly where he'd been when the girl left him, hat in his hands now, turning it slowly by the brim in a way that seemed less like a habit and more like the only thing his hands could find to do. He was watching his daughter. His face was... It was the face of a man who had not cried in a very long time and was not going to start now in Harlan Briggs's barn, but it was a near thing. He walked across the room. He stopped when he was close enough to speak without raising his voice. He looked at his daughter, still attached to Eleanor's waist. Then he looked at Eleanor. "She doesn't do this," he said. It wasn't an apology and it wasn't an accusation. It was just a fact, delivered in a voice roughened by cold air and years of talking mostly to himself in the mountain. "She hasn't—" He stopped, started again. "Not since her mother." "I know," Eleanor said quietly. She didn't know what she knew exactly, just that this was real, and the child was real, and the weight of those small arms was the realest thing that had happened to her in longer than she could say. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the room. The room looked back. 40 people holding their breath, waiting to see what came next, aware that something was happening here that they hadn't been prepared for and weren't sure how to receive. He looked at Thomas Pruitt, who had gone very still and very red. He looked at Jeremiah Pruitt, who had stopped grinning. He looked at Ruth Alderman, who had pressed her lips together into a thin, flat line. He looked at Eleanor again. And then Gideon Mercer, who had not said more than a dozen words at a time to any person in Briar Ridge in the past 2 years, opened his mouth and changed everything. "I came down because Clara needed people," he said. His voice was even, careful, like a man picking his footing on uncertain ground. "I've been..." He exhaled through his nose. "I've been failing her. I know it. She doesn't talk. She doesn't eat right. She has nightmares I don't know how to stop." He looked at his daughter, who had not loosened her grip on Eleanor. "She's been asking me for a mother." Nobody breathed. "I've been telling her I can't." He stopped again, set his jaw. "I don't know this woman. I know that. But my daughter knows her somehow, and Clara has better judgment than most people I've met." He turned the hat in his hands once more. stopped. I'm not a man who does things halfway. If my daughter has chosen, then I'll honor that choice. Ruth Alderman said, Gideon, you can't be— I'm speaking, he said without raising his voice, and she stopped. He looked at Eleanor, and Eleanor Vane, who had come to this barn with blueberry preserves and the practiced invisibility of a woman who'd learned to take up less space than she needed, felt her pulse in her throat and her hands and her feet all at once. I'm asking you, he said. Tonight, if you're willing, we can do it proper. Get Reverend Holt. Make it legal. I've got a cabin and land and enough to provide. It's hard country up in the hollow, but it's honest. His eyes met hers and held. They were not romantic eyes. They were the eyes of a man making a serious offer to another serious person. I know it's not how things are done, but I'm asking. The room waited. Eleanor looked down at the child. The child looked up at her. Mama. Yes, Eleanor said. The word came out smaller than she intended. She cleared her throat. Said it again. Yes. The marriage happened that night. Reverend Holt was located. He had been in the corner with the card players, which he would later not mention from the pulpit. And the necessary words were said in front of 40 witnesses who had come expecting a social evening and gotten something considerably more complicated. Eleanor stood beside Gideon Mercer with Clara pressed between them and spoke her vows in a clear, steady voice, while her heart did things she couldn't name, and her hands— she couldn't get them to stop trembling, so she held them together in front of her and hoped nobody noticed. She noticed Ruth Alderman leave before it was finished. She noticed Jeremiah Pruitt not looking at her. She noticed that Thomas Pruitt, when Reverend Holt pronounced them married, started to cry. Not mean crying, not laughing crying, but the confused, overwhelmed tears of a child who understood on some level that he had done something he could not undo and wasn't sure yet what that meant. She did not feel triumphant. She felt the way she imagined it felt to step off a ledge, that suspended moment before gravity makes its decision, when you don't know yet whether you jump towards something or away from it. Gideon shook Reverend Holt's hand. He accepted the congratulations of the men who offered them with the slightly bewildered courtesy of someone still not entirely certain how he arrived at this moment. He did not smile. He had, Eleanor was beginning to suspect, a face that smiled rarely and meant it when it did. Clara held Eleanor's hand the whole time. She did not say anything else. She didn't need to. Harlan Briggs, who was a decent man and always had been, brought out a bottle of something he'd been saving and poured it for Gideon and pressed Eleanor's hand between both of his and said, quietly, "You'll be all right, Eleanor. You're tougher than you look." She laughed, which startled her. "I'd like to think I look fairly tough." Harlan grinned. "Tougher than that. They left Briar Ridge before midnight. Eleanor had a bag. Everything she owned that mattered fit in one bag. Her sewing kit, her good shears, 3 changes of clothes, the small carved box her mother had left her with nothing in it because her mother had nothing to leave but the box. She'd packed it in less than 20 minutes while Gideon waited outside with Clara and the horse, standing in her small rented room and looking at the walls she'd looked at for 7 years and feeling something she couldn't quite call sadness exactly. More like the recognition of an ending. She closed the door behind her. She did not look back at it. Outside, Gideon had already settled Clara in front of him on the horse. He looked at Eleanor's bag and looked at the horse and did the geometry of the problem with the expression of a man who had not fully thought this part through. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Badly," she said. A pause. "I'll walk." "It's 4 miles." "I've walked 4 miles before." He took her bag and tied it to the saddle. "The cold won't kill me tonight." She started to argue and then looked at his face, the set of his jaw, the particular quality of his stillness, and understood that he was not doing this as a demonstration of gallantry or sacrifice. He was doing it because it was the practical solution, and he did not have a better one, and he would not pretend otherwise. She climbed up. It was graceless. She was not a small woman, and this was not a small horse, but neither of them was designed for this sort of mounting, and she managed it after 2 attempts with her face hot and her dignity somewhere on the ground beneath the horse's hooves. Gideon said nothing about it. He just started walking. Clara settled in front of Eleanor with the reins between them, leaned back against Eleanor's chest within about 10 minutes, and fell asleep. Eleanor put one arm around her. The horse moved through the dark and the cold. Behind them, Briar Ridge's lights dwindled and then disappeared. Eleanor looked up. The sky was extraordinary, the kind of black that only happens far from settlement lights, scattered through with stars that had no consideration for what a person was feeling and burned brilliantly regardless. She looked at them until her neck ached and then looked at the road ahead. Gideon walked. She could hear his boots on the frozen ground. He didn't talk. She didn't talk. The horse breathed. Clara's weight was warm and steady against her chest, and Eleanor held her carefully, the way you hold something you don't yet understand the value of, but already know you don't want to drop. After a while, without planning to, she said, "Her braids. Did you do them?" "Yes," he said from the dark beside her. "They're—" She chose the word. "Sincere." A pause that might have contained a laugh, and then didn't. "She won't let me undo them and start over." "No, she seems certain." Another pause. "She's been more certain than me about most things since she was 2. He said it without humor and without self-pity, just observation. A man taking stock. Her mother used to say Clara had been born knowing something the rest of us had to figure out. Eleanor didn't respond to that because she wasn't sure she should. She looked at the stars instead. "I meant what I said," Gideon said, after a while. "Back in the barn. About providing." "I know. I can't." He stopped. She could hear him choosing words the way a man chooses footing in bad weather. "I'm not offering sentiment. I haven't got that in me right now. Maybe not. I don't know what I've got left in that direction." He sounded like a man being honest at some cost to himself. "But I meant the rest of it." Eleanor looked at the back of his head, the set of his shoulders, the way he walked, straight, deliberate, like a man who'd learned that the ground didn't give you anything for free and had stopped expecting it to. "I'm not looking for sentiment," she said. "I haven't spent my whole life being mocked for my looks to start expecting someone to write me poetry." This time, the pause did contain something like a laugh. Brief, almost involuntary, like it had happened before he could decide against it. "Fair." She looked back at the road ahead. The stars burned on, indifferent and magnificent. Clara slept. And Eleanor Vane, Eleanor Mercer, now, which would take some time to believe, rode toward the mountains with her child sleeping against her chest, and her husband walking beside her in the dark, and she thought, "I don't know if this is the right thing. I don't know if anything about tonight makes sense by any measure I've ever used, but I am done being what this town decided I was." The pines grew taller as they climbed, closing in on either side of the trail, and the lights of Briar Ridge were long gone, and whatever waited in Iron Hollow waited for her now, and she had never been the kind of woman to turn around once she'd decided to go. The cabin came into view just past 2 in the morning. Eleanor had been expecting, she wasn't sure what she'd been expecting. Something rough, something that said single man living alone in the mountains in every beam and board. She was not wrong. The cabin was solid in the way that things built for survival rather than comfort are solid. It would stand, it would hold out wind and snow, it would not fall down on anyone. But the porch step was rotted through on the left side. The shutter on the east-facing window hung at an angle that suggested its hinge had given up its argument with the weather and agreed to disagree. The woodpile was adequate, but not generous. Smoke came from the chimney. Gideon had banked the fire before leaving, and the smell of pine and wood ash was in the cold air. Gideon lifted Clara down from the horse while Eleanor climbed down on her own, which was easier than getting up had been, and only slightly less graceless. He carried the sleeping child inside while Eleanor stood on the porch and looked at the door and breathed. The inside was dim and cold at the edges and firelit at the center. A table, 2 chairs, a cot along the wall where she assumed Clara slept, a larger bed in the back corner. The walls had gaps where the chinking had come loose, and through one of them she could see a strip of night sky. Gideon laid Clara on the cot and pulled a blanket over her. He straightened, turned. He and Eleanor looked at each other across the small room. He seemed to become aware simultaneously that there was one bed. "I'll sleep by the fire," he said. "All right," she said. Neither of them pointed out that this was not a long-term solution. Neither of them was ready for that conversation. He found her an extra blanket, heavy wool, smelling of cedar and horse, and something else she couldn't identify. And she took off her coat and sat on the edge of the bed and took off her boots and lay down without undressing further, because she was tired in every direction and the bed was there. She listened to the fire. She listened to the wind picking up outside, moving through the pines. She listened to Clara's even breathing and Gideon's measured movements as he settled near the hearth, and somewhere in the middle of listening for all of it, she went to sleep. She did not sleep well. She never slept well in strange places. But she slept. And in the morning, when the light came gray and thin through the frost-edged window, and Clara appeared at the bedside with serious eyes and tangled braids and said, "Are you real?" Eleanor said, "As real as it gets." Clara considered this, then climbed up and pressed herself against Eleanor's side like a small, serious heater. Eleanor put her arm around her. Outside, she could hear Gideon already moving, already working, already beginning the day with the relentless purposefulness of a man who'd learned that mornings didn't wait on feelings. She lay there, with the child warm against her side, and the strange cabin around her and the mountain loud with wind beyond the walls. And she thought, "They laughed at you last night. And then this happened. Figure that out." She couldn't. She didn't try too hard. She just held the child and watched the light change on the log walls and waited to see what came next. Whatever it was, she was already here. The first week was the hardest thing Eleanor had ever done, and she had done hard things her whole life. She woke the second morning before dawn, which she hadn't planned, and lay in the dark listening to sounds she didn't recognize. The particular groan of the cabin's logs contracting in the cold, the wind finding the gaps in the chinking and sliding through in thin, searching currents, the sound of something moving in the trees outside that she told herself was probably a deer and chose not to investigate further. Clara was still pressed against her side, having migrated there sometime in the night with the unerring instinct of a child who had found a warm thing and intended to keep it. Gideon was already gone from his place by the fire. She could hear him outside, the rhythmic crack of an axe on wood, steady and unhurried as a clock. She lay there for another few minutes because she was honest enough with herself to admit that she wasn't ready to get up and face the reality of where she was and what she'd agreed to. Then Clara stirred, and her small stomach made an audible complaint, and Eleanor got up. The cabin in morning light was not more welcoming than it had been at 2 in the morning, but it was at least comprehensible. She could see the problems now. The gap in the chinking above the window, the warped board near the door that left a finger width of cold air running along the floor, the shelf above the fireplace that tilted enough to make everything on it slightly suspect. The fireplace itself was serviceable, and the pot hanging over it was heavy cast iron, which was something. She found cornmeal, she found salt, she found a small crock of lard and a half wedge of hard cheese that had seen better days but was still edible. She made do. Clara appeared at her elbow while she was stirring, silent as a cat, watching with those dark, serious eyes. "Cornmeal mush," Eleanor told her. "I know it's not exciting." Clara considered. "Papa burns it." "I won't burn it. He always says that." "I imagine he does." Eleanor kept stirring. "Does he burn everything or just the cornmeal?" "Everything's soft," Clara said, with the diplomatic precision of someone who had given the matter genuine thought. "Hard things he's fine with. Jerky, hard biscuits." "Good to know." Clara pulled herself up to sit on the edge of the table, not asking permission, just doing it, which Eleanor respected, and watched her cook with the focused attention of a child who had learned that watching carefully was often more useful than asking questions. She had that quality, Eleanor was beginning to notice. That stillness. Other children fidgeted constantly, filled silence with noise, needed to be entertained. Clara just watched. She was, in some way Eleanor couldn't quite articulate, an unusually old child. The door opened and Gideon came in, bringing a wash of cold air and the smell of pine sap and exertion. He stopped when he saw the pot. "You cooked," he said. "I did." He pulled off his gloves and looked at Clara. "You let her do that?" "I didn't let her," Clara said. "She just did it." Something moved in Gideon's face. Not quite amusement, not quite relief. He sat down at the table without further comment, which Eleanor was coming to understand was his version of acceptance. She put a bowl in front of him. He ate it without ceremony and without complaint, which was also, she suspected, his version of a compliment. Afterward, while Clara went to fetch water from the stream, a task she performed with the competence of someone who'd been doing it since she was old enough to carry a bucket. Gideon stood by the door pulling on his coat, and Eleanor brought up the wall. "The chinking above the east window," she said. "I can see sky through it." He looked at her. "I know. I'll need clay and straw, or oakum if you have it." "I've got some." "In the shed." He paused. "It's on the list." "What list?" A short silence. "The list of things that need doing that I haven't gotten to." She kept her voice neutral. "How long is the list?" He looked at her steadily. "Long." They looked at each other. She could see him waiting for judgment, for the complaint, for the "this is not what I expected, this is not adequate." The set of his jaw was braced for it. "All right," she said. "Show me where the shed is." "Oh." She rechinked the east wall that afternoon with her hands stiff from cold and clay under her fingernails, and she was bad at it in the beginning. She'd never done it before, and the first section she did came out lumpy and uneven in a way that Gideon, passing by with a load of wood, observed without comment. She pulled it out and did it again. By the third attempt, she had something that would hold. She moved to the next gap. It was Clara who kept her company through it, sitting on an overturned bucket and talking in the measured, intermittent way she had, not chattering, never chattering, but offering occasional observations that Eleanor was beginning to collect like small stones, each one telling her something about the shape of this child's interior life. "Mama used to fix things too," Clara said at one point. Eleanor kept her hands moving. "What kinds of things?" "Everything." A pause. She didn't like waiting for Papa to get to it. She said men put things on lists, and lists don't fix anything. She wasn't wrong. Papa says she was impatient. "What do you think?" Clara thought about it seriously, the way she thought about everything. "I think she just didn't like cold coming through the walls." "That's a very reasonable position," Eleanor said. Clara nodded as if something had been confirmed. Then, "Are you going to stay?" Eleanor looked at her. The child was watching her with those steady, old-person eyes, asking the question the way someone asks it when they already know the answer might not be the one they want. "Yes," Eleanor said. "Even when it's hard?" "Clara." She sat back on her heels and looked at the girl directly. "Where I came from, people spent years making things hard for me. I know how to handle hard. This," she gestured at the wall, at the cabin, at the mountain beyond it. "This is a different kind of hard, but I'm not afraid of it." Clara looked at her for a long moment. "Okay," she said finally. "Just that." "Okay." But she leaned forward on her bucket and handed Eleanor the next piece of dried clay without being asked, and Eleanor took it, and that was the beginning of something they never put a name to, but both understood perfectly well. The second week was harder in different ways. The cold came in earnest. Not the manageable cold of the settlement below, where a woman could keep warm by staying near a fire and limiting her time outside, but the iron hollow cold, which was a different animal entirely. It lived in the walls and in the floor, and came up through boot leather if you stood still too long. It made the morning haul of water a trial that left Eleanor's hands aching for an hour after she came inside. It got into the food stores, frosting the cornmeal in the barrel and requiring the lard crock to be kept near the fire, or it would solidify past using. Eleanor had not chopped wood before. She had split kindling once or twice, back when she'd rented a room with a small stove and the landlord was feeling generous with the equipment. But the kind of wood splitting Gideon did, the full-size logs that fed the main fireplace, required a technique she didn't have and an axe heavier than she'd expected, and a great deal of stubbornness, which was the one thing she had in surplus. The first time she picked up the axe, Gideon was watching from the shed doorway. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know I don't have to." She set a log upright on the splitting block. "I'd like to know how." "It's—" He stopped. She looked at him. "It's what?" He looked like a man trying to decide how to say something without saying the thing he was actually thinking. She waited. "Nothing," he said, and went back into the shed. She knew what the nothing was. She was large, yes, but large didn't mean what men always assumed it meant. It didn't mean strong in the right directions, didn't mean her shoulders were built for this particular motion. She swung the axe and it glanced off the log, and she nearly lost her grip on the handle and the log rolled off the block. She set it back up, swung again, better. The log split part way but not through. She worked at it for 20 minutes, slow and imprecise, learning from each failed swing without ever admitting to the failures out loud. By the end of it, she had a respectable pile of split wood and hands that would ache for 2 days, and she was unreasonably pleased with herself. Gideon came out of the shed and looked at the pile. "Your grip is wrong," he said. "I know. I can show you. Tomorrow," she said, because her pride needed at least one night to settle. "You can show me tomorrow." He almost smiled. She was almost certain of it. It was brief, and it was gone before she could confirm it, but the corners of his eyes did something, and she filed it away. The judgment from below found them before the month was out. It arrived the way judgment usually arrives, not all at once, but in pieces, each one small enough that you might tell yourself it was nothing if you were in the habit of telling yourself things were nothing. Eleanor was not in that habit. The first piece came from a woman named Ada Colson, who lived at the base of the Highland Trail and whose husband ran pelts south twice a year. Ada appeared at the cabin one gray afternoon with a loaf of bread and an expression of studied sympathy, and Eleanor invited her in because that was what you did. Ada sat at the table and drank the tea Eleanor made and looked around the cabin with the specific type of smile that takes careful inventory without appearing to. "It's very rustic," Ada said. "It's a working cabin," Eleanor said pleasantly. "Of course." Ada broke a small piece off the bread she'd brought and didn't eat it. "I heard about what happened at the gathering. I imagine everyone did. People are—" Ada chose her words the way she chose everything, Eleanor suspected, with an eye toward maximum information and minimum accountability. "People are concerned about the situation." "Which aspect of the situation concerns them?" Ada looked at her directly for the first time since sitting down. "Eleanor, he married you in one evening, without knowing you. You have to understand how that looks." "How does it look?" "Like—" She stopped, reorganized. "Some people are saying you took advantage of the situation, of his grief." Eleanor set her cup down carefully. The fire popped. Outside, she could hear Clara in the yard talking to herself the way she'd started doing. Not full conversations, just small narrated observations. "This rock is cold, this stick is a good stick." And the sound of it was both dear and distracting. "Some people," Eleanor said. "Ruth Alderman?" Ada's non-answer was the most thorough answer she could have given. "Ada," Eleanor kept her voice level. "I was standing in that barn being laughed at. I did not engineer a 6-year-old child to cross the room and call me her mother. I did not ask Gideon Mercer to do what he did." She looked at the woman across from her. "He made his choice. I made mine. If people in Briar Ridge would like to spend their winter speculating about my motives instead of minding their own concerns, I can't stop them. But I'd appreciate it if you'd go back and tell them that I am not sitting up in this mountain pining for their approval." Ada left shortly after. Eleanor stood at the window and watched her go down the trail, and then turned to find Gideon in the doorway from the back room. She hadn't heard him come in. "How long were you standing there?" she said. "Long enough?" She waited to see if he was going to say something about it, about whether he believed her, about whether Ada's version of what people were saying had landed anywhere that mattered. His face was, as usual, its own difficult country. "I didn't ask you for sentiment," he said finally, which was not what she expected. "I know the situation. I know what it looks like." He met her eyes. "I don't need you to defend yourself to me." "I wasn't defending myself to you. I was explaining myself to Ada." "I know." A pause. "You did it well." It was, she understood, the closest thing to "I believe you" that he currently knew how to say. She took it for what it was. "The bread's good," she said. "Whatever else she is, Ada Colson bakes well." "She does," he agreed, and sat down at the table, and the conversation was over. What no one in Briar Ridge accounted for, what Eleanor herself hadn't fully anticipated, was Clara. The transformation was not dramatic. It was not sudden. It happened the way thaws happen, so gradual that you look up one day and realize the ice is gone without being able to name the morning it left. Clara began to talk more. Not a flood of words. She was still her father's daughter, still measured and deliberate in what she chose to say, but more. She asked Eleanor questions about sewing and got a needle and thread and practiced on scraps of canvas. She asked Eleanor about the settlement below and listened with genuine interest to stories of people and events she'd never been part of. She began to eat without being coaxed, which Gideon noticed and said nothing about, but Eleanor could see the change in him each time he watched Clara finish her bowl without the usual battle. One evening, about 3 weeks in, Eleanor was mending a tear in Gideon's heaviest work coat by the fire. The lining had come loose and the cold was getting through, and Clara climbed up beside her and leaned against her arm and watched her work. "Will you teach me?" Clara asked. "To sew?" "To do all of it," she gestured vaguely. "Everything you know?" Eleanor looked at her. "That's going to take a while." "I know." Clara picked at a thread on her own sleeve. "I've got time." Eleanor laughed. Came out genuine and a little surprised, the way laughs do when they're not managed. "Yes," she said. "You do. We both do." She threaded a smaller needle and handed it over. "Start here. See that canvas scrap? Practice making your stitches even." Clara took the needle with the solemn concentration of someone receiving important equipment and bent over the scrap, tongue between her teeth, working. Gideon, across the room, had his back to them. He was repairing a trap, working with the focused quiet of a man with his hands busy and his attention elsewhere. But Eleanor saw his shoulders change, some tension she'd stopped noticing because it was always there, releasing in small degrees, like a fist slowly opening. She looked back at the coat in her hands. The fire was good. The walls held. The wind moved through the pines outside in a long, low sound like breathing. It was not easy. It was not even close to easy. Eleanor's hands ached every night from the cold and the work, and there were mornings she lay in the early dark and took stock of the distance between where she was and where anything she'd ever imagined for herself lived. And the distance was significant, and she didn't lie to herself about it. She was in a strange cabin with a man she barely knew and a child she was learning as fast as she could, and a winter that had no interest in her personal trajectory. But Clara's hand, when she reached out in the night, was always warm. And the stitches on the canvas scrap, by the end of that evening, were improving. She took what was real and she held on to it. That was all she knew how to do. It had always been enough before. She chose to believe it would be enough now. Spring came to Iron Hollow the way it always came to High Country. Reluctantly, in pieces, with frequent reversals that made you distrust every warm afternoon. The snow pulled back from the south-facing slopes first, leaving dark earth and flattened dead grass, and the occasional startling green thing pushing through where no green thing had any business being yet. The creek rose. The pines dripped for days. Clara started spending every spare hour outside, which Gideon allowed with the pragmatic acceptance of a man who knew you could not keep a child indoors once the world started thawing. Eleanor watched the mountain change from the repaired porch. The step was solid now. She'd replaced the rotted board in February using timber from the shed and Gideon's instruction on how to cut it square, which had involved 2 miscuts and 1 incident with a chisel she did not discuss, and tried to name what she was feeling. It wasn't contentment exactly. It wasn't happiness in the uncomplicated way that word usually got used. It was something more honest than that, something closer to the feeling of a joint that had been out of place for a long time, finally sitting right. Not painless, not perfect, but correct. She and Gideon had reached a kind of equilibrium that neither of them had designed, and neither of them talked about directly. They worked alongside each other with the practical efficiency of 2 people who had learned each other's rhythms without making a ceremony of it. He split wood. She stacked it and organized the pile so the driest timber was accessible from the top. She cooked. He cleaned up after, which he did quietly and thoroughly in a way that told her someone had taught him that skill, and he'd kept it even when there was no one left to notice. They made decisions about the cabin and the land with a minimum of discussion, not because they agreed on everything, but because they'd both been alone long enough to understand that some decisions just needed making, and the making mattered more than whose idea it was. What they did not do was talk about themselves, about the past, about feeling, about the growing thing between them that both of them could sense, and neither of them was ready to look at directly. They circled it the way you circle a fire that's still hot, close enough to feel the warmth, far enough to avoid getting burned. Clara had no such caution. Clara simply loved Eleanor the way children love things they've decided on. Completely, without hedging, with a matter-of-fact certainty that made adults feel both grateful and faintly ashamed of their own complications. She braided Eleanor's hair one morning with the same determined imprecision Gideon applied to hers, and Eleanor sat still for it, feeling Clara's small hands working, and thought that there were things in this world that came at you sideways and turned out to be the most important things you ever received. It was into this careful, hard-won quiet that Victor Kane arrived. Tis. Eleanor first heard the name from Pete Calloway, who came up the Highland Trail in early April with a mule loaded with trade goods, and the expression of a man carrying news he didn't entirely understand but knew was significant. He sat at their table and drank coffee and told them about the railroad agent who'd ridden into Briar Ridge 3 weeks prior with 2 associates and a leather satchel full of papers and taken a room at the Garfield Inn and started asking questions. Not hostile questions, careful ones, the kind that came wrapped in friendliness and good humor, the kind that made you answer before you'd decided whether you should. Name's Kane, Pete said. Victor Kane. Says he's from the regional land office, come to verify claims and settle disputed parcels before the railroad survey. He turned his cup in his hands. Problem is, there's at least 4 families below been told their claim papers have discrepancies. Papers they've held for years, mind you. Suddenly, there are discrepancies. Gideon was quiet for a moment. What kind of discrepancies? Filing errors, he says, wrong dates, missing signatures, boundary descriptions that don't match the new survey standards. Pete shook his head. Webb Harmon's been on his parcel since before his eldest was born. Now he's being told he may need to refile, and in the meantime his timber rights are frozen pending review. Frozen by whom? By Kane. He's got letters of authority from the territorial office. Pete looked at Gideon. The Crowley brothers have been seen with him, riding together in the evenings. That landed differently. Eleanor watched Gideon's face close the way a shutter closes. Not out, just in, just sealed. The Crowley brothers were known to her by reputation. Denton and Hugh Crowley, who ran a rough operation north of the settlement and had been in varying degrees of conflict with Gideon over access to Highland timber for at least 3 years. There had been a confrontation the previous fall, before Eleanor's time, that Pete alluded to but didn't detail and Gideon did not explain. After Pete left, Eleanor stood at the window and looked at the tree line and said, "Tell me about the Crowleys." Gideon was at the table, not moving. They've been trying to get access to the Hollow's timber since before Mary died. The old claim on the upper ridge predates the territorial survey. It's mine by settlement, right? But the documentation is... He stopped. My filing was informal, done before the territory required the newer forms. It's valid under the original statute, but it could be challenged under the new standards. She turned around. Challenged how? If someone with authority decided to question the boundary description. He looked at her. The upper ridge alone has enough pine and spruce to run a railroad company's construction needs for 2 years. She sat down across from him. And Kane has letters of authority from the territorial office. Apparently. Have you seen those letters? No? Has anyone? A pause. Pete said Webb Harmon saw them, said they looked official. Looking official and being official, Eleanor said slowly, are 2 different things. Gideon watched her. I need to see his documents, she said. Why? Because I can read a land contract. She said it plainly, without performance. My father was a land clerk in Ohio before he died. I sat in his office for 6 years and learned everything he knew because there was nothing else to do and he didn't believe in idle hands. She looked at Gideon steadily. I know what a legitimate territorial filing looks like. I know what the required language is, what the authorization signatures should say, what a properly bounded claim description requires. I haven't done it in years, but I haven't forgotten it either. Dima si poeche. He was quiet for long enough that she started to think he didn't believe her. Clara, he called. Clara appeared from the back room, where she'd been pretending not to listen with the transparent diligence of a 6-year-old. What? Go check on the chickens. I already checked on the chickens. Check on them again. Clara gave him a long look that contained several things she'd decided not to say, then went outside. The door closed. Through the window, Eleanor could see her going dutifully toward the chicken coop with the expression of someone fulfilling an obligation under protest. Gideon looked at Eleanor. How do you plan to see his documents? I don't know yet, But someone in that settlement has seen them, and if what he's doing isn't legitimate, the documents will show it. She pressed her hands flat on the table. These things leave tracks, Gideon. Forged authority letters have wrong dates, wrong signatory titles, language that doesn't match the current territorial statutes. A real filing from the regional land office has specific forms, numbered, stamped, with a clerk's counter-signature. If Kane is inventing authority, the papers will tell it. And if they're real, then we find out what we're actually up against, and we deal with that. She met his eyes. But I don't think they're real. A legitimate agent doesn't ride in alongside the Crowley brothers. Gideon was silent again. Outside, Clara was talking to the chickens with the same measured seriousness she applied to most things. All right, he said. I'll go down to the settlement. We'll go, Eleanor said. He looked at her. They know me, she said. People talk to me. Women especially. They'll tell me things they won't tell you because you walk into a room and people stop talking. She didn't say it as a criticism. I can move through that town and listen in ways you can't. Something shifted in his expression. Not resistance, exactly. More like the recalibration she'd seen that first night in the barn, when Clara had crossed the room and everything he'd planned had rearranged itself. You haven't been back since the wedding. I know. They'll talk. They were already talking. She stood up. Let them. I've been surviving talk my whole life. I'd rather go back there and do something useful than sit up here waiting for someone to take what's yours. He held her gaze, then he nodded. Just watch her once. Well, they went down 2 days later, leaving Clara with Ada Colson. A compromise that neither Eleanor nor Ada found entirely comfortable, but that Clara accepted with the philosophical resignation of a child who understood she was being parked and was choosing not to make it a conflict. Briar Ridge in spring was louder than Eleanor remembered. The mud season brought a particular kind of activity, people repairing and restocking and moving after the long winter stillness, wagons on the main road, livestock being shifted between pens. Eleanor walked through it beside Gideon and felt the settlement recalibrate to their presence. Heads turned, conversations paused. She kept her chin level and her pace steady and pretended not to notice, which was a skill she'd had so long it was almost automatic. Ruth Alderman, crossing from the dry goods store, saw Eleanor and made a visible decision to be somewhere else. Eleanor watched her go without expression. They split up by quiet agreement, Gideon to speak with Webb Harmon and the other affected landowners, Eleanor to the places where information moved freely. She went to Martha Briggs' house first because Martha was Harlan's wife, and Harlan was the kind of man who talked at home, and Martha was the kind of woman who listened carefully and remembered everything. Martha brought her inside without ceremony and put coffee in front of her and said, I wondered when you'd come down. I should have come sooner, Eleanor said. How is everyone taking this? Martha sat across from her and wrapped both hands around her own cup. She was a broad, capable woman with gray streaks in her brown hair and the particular tiredness of someone managing a household and a worry simultaneously. Scared, she said. Webb Harmon has been on that land 12 years. He has got no idea how to fight a land office ruling. And Kane is... She shook her head. He's smooth. That's the word for him. Smooth. Comes to the social evenings, buys rounds at the inn, talks to everyone like he's doing them a favor by listening. People want to like him. But Denton Crowley was seen going into Kane's room at the inn 2 nights ago through the back stairs. Martha's eyes were flat and steady. Denton Crowley has never done anything in his life that wasn't to his own direct advantage. If he's involved with this railroad man, it's because he stands to gain. Have you seen Kane's authorization papers? Harlan did. He went to Kane and asked to examine them directly. She paused. Kane showed him what he said was a letter from the Territorial Land Commissioner. Harlan said it looked right to him, but Harlan's not a lawyer. No, Eleanor said, but I may know someone who can tell whether it was right or not. She looked at her coffee. Martha, do you know if anyone kept a copy of what they were shown, or wrote down anything they read? Martha was quiet. Then she got up and went to the back of the house. Eleanor heard a drawer open, then close. Martha came back with a folded piece of paper. Webb Harmon wrote down the authorization number and the signatory name, she said. He didn't know why exactly. He said it just seemed like the kind of thing worth writing down. Eleanor unfolded the paper. The authorization number was stamped TLO-1 1874-CR-229. The signatory was listed as one Commissioner D.A. Relic. What? Regional Land Office, Territorial Division. Eleanor looked at it for a long time. Her father's office, the smell of ink and paper, and the particular dust of files. 6 years of watching and learning because there was nothing else to do. What is it? Martha said. The Territorial Land Office reorganized in 1871, Eleanor said slowly. After reorganization, the commissioner's title changed. It became Regional Superintendent, not Commissioner. That title, Commissioner Relic, that's the pre-reorganization title. She pressed her finger on the stamp. And the authorization series, CR, stands for Claim Review. But after 1871, claim review letters used the prefix PCR, Pending Claim Review. The old series was retired. She looked up. This document uses pre-reorganization language with a post-1871 authorization number. You can't have both. Martha stared at her. You're saying it's false. I'm saying it's wrong in ways that a real document from that office wouldn't be wrong. She folded the paper carefully. I need to see the original, or at least more of it. One discrepancy could be a clerical error. Multiple discrepancies are a pattern. Kane keeps his satchel with him, Martha said. He doesn't leave it at the inn. I know, Eleanor thought. But he goes to the evening socials, and he brings the satchel because he uses it. He's been pulling papers out and showing them to people. He's comfortable. She looked at Martha. Is there one tonight? Friday gathering at the Garfields. Martha looked at her with something between admiration and apprehension. Eleanor, if Kane realizes you're looking, he'll be looking at Gideon, Eleanor said. Men like Kane always watch the man they consider the threat. They don't watch the woman standing next to him. Martha was quiet for a moment. Then quietly, they were very wrong about you, Eleanor, back in the fall. The things people said. Eleanor stood up. I know, she said, without bitterness. They usually are. She found Gideon outside Webb Harmon's property, talking with Harmon and 2 other men she recognized, brothers named Fisk, who ran cattle on the eastern edge of the settlement. All 3 men had the same expression, the expression of men who had worked for everything they owned and were watching someone threaten to take it on paper. She pulled Gideon aside and told him what she'd found. He listened without interrupting, which she'd come to understand was how he processed serious information, fully, in silence, before he responded. You're sure? He said. I'm sure the numbers don't add up. I want to see more before I say it to anyone with authority. She held his gaze. The Friday gathering. I need to get close enough to that satchel to see what's in it. His jaw tightened. If he catches you going through his papers, he won't. And even if he does, looking at documents in a public gathering isn't a crime. She kept her voice steady. Gideon, what he's doing to these people, to Webb Harmon, to the Fisk brothers, to you, that's the crime. I just need the evidence to prove it. He looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon light was flat and gray, clouds building in the west the way they did before spring rain. His face was doing the thing it did when he was working through something he didn't like but could see was right. All right, he said finally. All right, she agreed. Around them, the settlement moved through its afternoon. People who'd worked this ground for years, built their homes and buried their dead, and raised their children here, going about their ordinary business without knowing yet how close they were to losing it. Eleanor watched a woman hang washing on a line behind the Calloway house, and thought about 30 years of being told she didn't belong anywhere, and decided, quietly and completely, that she was not going to let Victor Kane take anything from any of these people without a fight. She'd been invisible in rooms her whole life. It was time to find out what she could do with that. The Friday gathering at the Garfields was the kind of social event that exists in every small settlement. Not quite a party, not quite a meeting, something in between that allows people to conduct the necessary business of community while pretending they're just having a pleasant evening. People brought food and drink and their best behavior and talked about weather and crops and neighbors, and underneath all of that, real things got decided and real alliances got formed and real assessments got made about who was trustworthy and who wasn't. Eleanor had attended enough of these evenings to know how they worked. She had spent years at their edges, present and unnoticed. Tonight she intended to be present and noticed in ways she could control, which was a different skill and a harder one. She and Gideon arrived together, which itself was a statement. The room registered them the way rooms register things that confirm or complicate existing narratives. A brief recalibration, conversations adjusting. She felt the looks without meeting them. Gideon stayed close, not hovering but there, and she was grateful for it in a way she didn't say. Victor Kane was already in the room. She'd expected smooth. Martha had said smooth, and Eleanor had mentally prepared for a kind of oily, obvious charm that would be easy to dislike. She was not entirely prepared for the specific reality of Victor Kane, which was that he was genuinely pleasant to look at, maybe 45, lean, with a face that suggested education and careful grooming and the kind of weathered handsomeness that worked better in lamplight than in daylight. He wore his clothes well. He laughed at the right moments. When Eleanor and Gideon came in, he looked at them with an expression of open, uncomplicated welcome that was so well constructed she almost believed it. "Mercer," he said, crossing toward them with his hand extended. "I was hoping you'd come down. I've been wanting to speak with you directly about the Highland parcel situation." Gideon shook the hand because not shaking it would have told Kane too much. "Kane. And this must be your wife." Kane turned to Eleanor with the same warm attention. "I've heard about you, Mrs. Mercer. The settlement talks." "I imagine it does," Eleanor said pleasantly. "All good things," he said, which was a lie delivered with such casual confidence that Eleanor had to admire the craftsmanship even as she catalogued it. "I hope we'll have a chance to talk tonight. The claim situation in the Hollow, I want to be sure you understand the process. These things can look more alarming than they are." "I'd welcome the clarity," Eleanor said. He smiled, moved on to the next group. The leather satchel was on the chair beside the fireplace where Kane had positioned himself, close to the warmth, close to the center of the room, accessible to the people he wanted to talk to. It was buckled, but not locked. She had noticed that in the first 30 seconds. She spent the next hour doing what she'd spent her life doing, moving through the room's edges, listening, being useful where she could be useful. She refilled cups. She listened to Ada Colson's detailed account of her sister-in-law's difficult winter. She stood with Martha Briggs near the food table and spoke quietly and watched the room. She watched Kane work the gathering with the systematic thoroughness of a man on a job, and she watched Denton Crowley, who had no business being at a Garfield social evening but was here anyway. Stationed near the back of the room with his brother Hugh, both of them not talking to Kane directly but watching him the way dogs watch a man with a piece of meat. She waited for her moment. It came when Kane was pulled into a conversation on the far side of the room by Webb Harmon, who had clearly decided to confront him directly, and was gesturing with the controlled frustration of a man trying to stay civil while his patience ran out. Kane had moved away from his chair. Two women had stepped in front of the fireplace to talk. The satchel sat on the chair alone. Eleanor walked to the fireplace. She stood with her back to the room, warming her hands, because it was genuinely cold near the windows, and warming your hands at the fire was the most natural thing in the world, and no one looked twice at a woman doing it. She let 30 seconds pass. She bent, as if adjusting her boot, and her hand found the satchel's buckle by touch. The buckle came open quietly. She didn't take anything. She couldn't take anything. That would be theft, and more importantly, it would give Kane grounds to discredit everything she found. She needed to see. She needed to read. Her fingers found the papers, and her eyes went to them fast and systematic, the way her father had taught her to scan a document, top to bottom, watching for the markers that told you what kind of document you were holding. Authorization letter. Territorial seal at the top. She read the signatory line. Commissioner D.A. Relic. Pre-reorganization title. Her stomach tightened. She kept going. There were 3 additional documents beneath the first. Survey revision orders. She scanned the format, the authorization codes, the dates. The second document was dated March 1874. The Territorial Surveying Office had changed its document numbering system in February 1874. This document used the old system with the new year. Impossible if it was genuine. The third document was a claim transfer authorization, the kind of paper that would allow a contested parcel to be transferred to a holding company pending resolution. The holding company's name was listed at the bottom, Crowley Meridian Land and Timber. There it was. She had the buckle refastened and was standing straight and warming her hands again in the time it took for one of the women by the fire to finish her sentence. Her heart was going hard and fast, and she made herself breathe slow because none of what she was feeling could be visible right now. Not yet. She found Gideon near the door talking to Pete Calloway and came to stand beside him. She didn't say anything. She put her hand on his arm, which she'd never done before in public, and felt him go still at the contact, not pulling away, just registering it. She pressed once, lightly, with her fingers. A signal. He continued his conversation without any outward change, but his arm shifted under her hand to acknowledge it. Across the room, Kane had finished with Webb Harmon. He looked over and his eyes found Eleanor, and for just a fraction of a second, so brief she might have imagined it, his expression recalibrated. Then the warm smile was back. He didn't know what she'd seen, but he had looked at her and made a calculation, and the calculation had shifted. He knows I'm not what he assumed, she thought. He doesn't know what I am yet, but he's wondering. Good. Let him wonder. She told Gideon everything on the trail back to Ada Colson's to collect Clara, keeping her voice low and her account precise. Dates, titles, the authorization series discrepancy, and most importantly, the name at the bottom of the transfer document. Gideon walked beside her and didn't interrupt. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Crowley Meridian, he said. That's what it said. That transfer document, if it were enacted, every contested parcel goes into that holding company's name pending resolution, which Kane controls the timeline for, which means he can keep parcels frozen and contested indefinitely while the Crowley brothers harvest the timber. She looked at him. It's not about the railroad. The railroad survey is the cover. The real game is the timber rights. Get the claims frozen, bring in Crowley operations under the holding company banner, strip the land before anyone gets their paperwork sorted. How long has this been planned? Long enough to build a convincing paper structure. These documents aren't rushed. They're careful. Someone invested time in them. She paused. But careful isn't the same as correct. The details are wrong because whoever made these didn't have access to the post-reorganization forms. They used the old templates. Gideon stopped walking. She stopped beside him. I need to get these in front of someone with authority, she said, not the county sheriff. Denton Crowley has been buying drinks for the sheriff's deputy since January, Pete told me. It needs to be territorial level, a judge, or the actual regional land office. The nearest territorial court is 4 days' ride. I know. He looked at her in the dark. The spring night was cold and clear, and the stars were doing what they always did, burning without any regard for the problems of the people below them. You memorized what you saw. Yes. Well enough to write it out? Well enough to write a formal complaint that a territorial clerk could act on. She met his eyes. I've been thinking about this since the moment I stood up from that satchel. We need to move before Kane does. If he senses that someone's looked at his documents and started asking questions, he'll push the transfer orders through on whatever claims are already in dispute, and it becomes much harder to unwind. How long do we have? I don't know. Days, maybe. A week, if we're lucky. He was quiet again. She had learned to let him be quiet. He wasn't stalling. He was thinking, and his thinking was worth waiting for. She'd discovered that about him over the winter, that what looked like slowness from the outside was actually thoroughness, a refusal to act on incomplete consideration that she'd come to respect even when it made her impatient. There's a man, he said finally, Judge Warren Aldis. He rode circuit through here 2 years back. He's based out of the territorial seat, but he has property outside of Mill Haven. He comes through twice a year to check on it. Harlan Briggs knows him. He looked at her. If Aldis is in the territory and Harlan can reach him, how long for Harlan to get there? 2 days hard riding, but Harlan has a good horse. Then we need to talk to Harlan tonight. They collected Clara, who was asleep on Ada's sofa, and transferred to Gideon's arms with the total boneless trust of a sleeping child, and did not wake up. Ada watched them from her doorway as they left and called out quietly, Eleanor. Eleanor turned. Ada looked at her for a moment with something that was not quite an apology, but was in the same neighborhood. You be careful, she said. Kane has people watching the road. I know, Eleanor said. It was a guess, but it felt right, and Ada's expression confirmed it. Harlan Briggs, woken after midnight by Gideon's knock, sat at his kitchen table in his nightclothes, and listened to Eleanor lay out everything she'd found with the focused attention of a man who took serious things seriously. His wife Martha sat beside him. Clara slept on their sofa in the other room. When Eleanor finished, Harlan looked at his wife. Martha looked back at him. Some conversation happened in that look that Eleanor couldn't read but recognized. The conversation of two people who'd been making decisions together for long enough that some of them happened without words. "I can ride to Millhaven tomorrow," Harlan said. "If Aldous is there, I'll reach him in 2 days." "Kane may move before you get back," Gideon said. "He may." Harlan looked at Eleanor. "How solid is what you found?" "Solid enough that any territorial clerk with current knowledge of the forms would see it immediately." She hesitated. "But Kane will say I'm lying, that I saw nothing. He'll say it's a woman's gossip and a mountain trapper's grudge." "Yes, he will," Harlan said. "Which is why I need you to write down everything you saw tonight. Every document, every number, every discrepancy. Tonight, before anything blurs." He stood up, went to his writing desk, and came back with paper and ink. He set it in front of Eleanor. "Write it like a legal account. Just the facts. What the document said and why it's wrong." She picked up the pen. Her hand was steady. She wrote for 40 minutes while Harlan and Gideon and Martha drank coffee and waited, and what she produced was 5 pages of close, careful documentation. Specific, dated, cross-referenced against the statutory changes she knew. She had never written a legal complaint before, but she had watched her father write them, and she had his instinct for what mattered. When she finished, Harlan read it through twice. Then he looked at Gideon. "She could have been a clerk," he said. "She could have been a lot of things," Gideon said quietly. But then, the crisis came before Harlan could ride. 2 mornings after the Garfield gathering, Eleanor was at the cabin splitting kindling when she heard horses on the trail. Not one horse, several. She put down the axe and stood in the yard and counted the sounds. 4, maybe 5 riders. The pace was deliberate. Not hurried, but purposeful. She went inside. "Gideon." He was at the table sharpening a knife and looked up at her face and stood. "Riders," she said. "Coming up." He moved to the window. She moved to where Clara was sitting by the fire with her canvas scrap and her needle and said quietly and calmly so it wouldn't frighten her, "Clara, go to the back room and stay there. Don't come out until I come for you." Clara looked at her face, reading it the way she read everything, completely, without flinching. "Is it bad?" "I don't know yet." She met the child's eyes. "You trust me?" "Yes." "Back room, go." Clara went. The riders came into the yard. Eleanor and Gideon went out together. Victor Kane sat on a bay horse in the center of their yard. Beside him were 2 men she didn't recognize. Broad, official-looking, with the practiced neutral faces of men who did this kind of work regularly. Behind them, on 2 horses, were Denton and Hugh Crowley. Denton was the older one, big, with a face that had been in enough conflicts to collect a permanent arrangement of scar tissue around his left eye. He looked at Eleanor with the specific contempt of a man who has decided a person is an obstacle. "Mercer," Kane said pleasantly. His voice was the same as it had been at the Garfield gathering. Warm, reasonable, the voice of a man certain that the ground was his. "I've come with eviction papers for the Upper Ridge parcel. Given the claim discrepancy, the parcel is being placed in provisional receivership pending territorial review." He held out a folded document toward Gideon. "I'd encourage you to accept service. It'll go easier." Gideon didn't take the paper. Kane's arm stayed extended. His pleasantness developed a slight edge. "Mr. Mercer." "Those papers aren't valid," Eleanor said. Kane looked at her. The edge sharpened further. "Mrs. Mercer, this is a legal proceeding. I'd ask you to let your husband—" "My husband will let me speak," Eleanor said. "Your authorization documents use pre-reorganization territorial language with post-reorganization authorization numbers. Commissioner Relic hasn't held that title since 1871. Your claim transfer documents route contested parcels to Crowley Meridian Land and Timber, which is not a territorial holding company. It's a private entity belonging to the men sitting on those horses behind you." She looked at Kane directly. "I have a written account of every discrepancy, signed and witnessed, already on its way to territorial court. So you can serve whatever papers you've brought, but you should know that they'll be examined by people who know what legitimate documents look like. The yard was very quiet. Denton Crowley's horse shifted. Denton pulled it back hard. Kane's pleasantness was gone now. What was underneath it was not angry. It was colder than angry, the specific coldness of a man recalculating a situation that has stopped going his way. He looked at Eleanor with the look of a man reassessing a thing he'd underestimated, which she recognized because men had been doing that to her all her life. "You went through my documents," he said. "I read documents in a public room," she said. "There's no law against reading. We'll see what a judge says about that." "I hope we do," she said. "I genuinely do." What happened next happened fast and ugly, the way real violence usually does. Not cinematic or clean, but fast and chaotic and shaped by who moved first. Denton Crowley moved first. He came off his horse and he was bigger than Eleanor had registered from a distance. And he went not for Gideon, but for Eleanor because she was the problem, and he'd understood that faster than Kane had. Gideon was between them before Denton covered 6 feet. What followed was not a clean fight. It was two men who both knew how to handle themselves, and neither of them inclined toward restraint. It was brutal and close and loud, and Eleanor grabbed the axe she'd left by the porch and put herself between the cabin door and Hugh Crowley, who had come off his horse with a look that said he'd been waiting for an excuse. "Don't," she said. Hugh looked at her, at the axe. He was calculating the math of the situation, and it was not, she could see, going entirely in his favor. "Lady," he said, "you don't want to—" "I've been splitting wood with this since January," she said. "Don't tell me what I want." He didn't move. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of the fight between Gideon and Denton. Hard, effortful sounds. The sounds of two large men doing serious damage to each other's general condition. Kane's two associates had not moved. They were, she was beginning to think, men who did paperwork and not this. And this had departed sufficiently from paperwork that they were uncertain of their role. Then there were other sounds. Horses on the trail, multiple horses, coming fast from below. Hugh Crowley heard them and looked toward the tree line. The horses came into view. 4, 5, 6 riders, and she recognized Pete Calloway, in front and behind him, Webb Harmon, and both the Fisk brothers and Harlan Briggs, and beside Harlan, wearing a gray coat and a judge's expression, a man she had never seen but recognized by posture as someone who carried authority and was comfortable in it. Judge Warren Aldis had been in Millhaven after all. And Harlan had not waited for morning to ride. Kane looked at the riders, looked at his two associates, looked at Denton Crowley, who had stopped fighting and was standing with blood on his face and Gideon's hand at his collar. Kane's face went through several things in quick succession: calculation, reassessment, something close to fury, and then settled into a careful blankness that told Eleanor he was already constructing his next move. But his next move, whatever it was going to be made in front of a territorial judge with Eleanor's signed and witnessed account already in hand. Aldis dismounted. He was a compact, gray-haired man with the kind of face that had heard a great deal and given away very little of what it thought about any of it. He looked at Kane. He looked at Gideon, who had released Denton Crowley and stepped back. He looked at the papers still in Kane's outstretched hand. He looked at Eleanor, standing with an axe in front of her cabin door. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "I've read your account. I have some questions." She lowered the axe. Her arms were shaking slightly, which she had not noticed until this moment. "Of course," she said. "Come inside. I'll make coffee." Hugh Crowley had stepped back to his horse. She didn't turn to watch him remount. She kept her eyes on the judge and on Kane, who was looking at her now with the particular expression of a man who has realized, too late, that he chose the wrong person to discount. She held the door open. Whatever came next, they would face it together, her and Gideon, this valley, these people who had worked this ground and deserved to keep what they'd built. She was done being the woman in the corner. Judge Warren Aldis drank his coffee black and asked his questions the same way. No softening, no preamble, just the direct line from question to answer that a man develops after years of sitting behind a bench and watching people waste his time with everything except the truth. He sat at their table with Eleanor's written account open in front of him and went through it section by section while Eleanor answered and Gideon stood near the window and Pete Calloway and Harlan Briggs crowded near the door because the cabin was not built to hold this many people and nobody had thought to address that. Outside, Webb Harmon and the Fisk brothers had positioned themselves in the yard near Kane and his two associates in the way that men position themselves when they want it, understood that leaving is not currently an option. The Crowley brothers had been separated. Denton, still bleeding from where Gideon's elbow had introduced itself to his face, sat on a stump looking at nothing in particular. Hugh stood near the horses looking like a man who wished he were somewhere else, which was the most sensible thing Hugh Crowley had felt in years. Clara had come out of the back room the moment Eleanor told her it was safe, and she had taken one look at the judge and the crowded cabin and climbed up to sit on the bed with her knees pulled to her chest and her dark eyes moving between the adults with the careful attention of someone filing everything away for later consideration. "The authorization series," Aldous said, tapping Eleanor's account. "You're certain about the PCR prefix change?" "The circular came down from the territorial office in January of 1871, Eleanor said. "My father received a copy. He made me read it because he said the point of having an assistant was having someone who knew the same things you knew." She kept her voice even. "The old CR series was formally retired as of March 1st of that year. Any claim review document issued after that date should carry the PCR prefix. The documents in Kane's satchel are dated 1874. "You read them in a public room." "I did." "Without removing them?" "Without removing them." Aldous looked at her for a moment. He had the kind of face that gave you nothing for free. "Your father was a land clerk in Ohio." 12 years. I worked alongside him for 6 of them." "And you never filed claims yourself?" "Women don't file claims," she said without inflection. "You know that." Something moved in his expression. Not sympathy, exactly. More like the acknowledgement of a fact he found professionally inconvenient. "What I know," he said, "is that the discrepancies you've identified, if accurate, constitute fraud against the territory and against individual settlers. That's a serious charge against a man who arrived here with letters of authority. Letters of authority that use a retired title for a commissioner who no longer holds that designation," Eleanor said. "I'm not making a serious charge on a hunch. I'm showing you the specific language that cannot exist in a legitimate document from that office in 1874. Aldous looked at her for another moment. Then he looked at Harlan. "Bring Kane in." What happened in the next 2 hours was not dramatic in the way Eleanor had imagined confrontations to be dramatic when she was younger. It was procedural and grinding and conducted mostly in the dry language of legal challenge and counter-assertion, and it was in its way more devastating to Kane than anything theatrical could have been. Kane was good. She had to give him that. He sat across the table from Aldous and produced his smooth reasonableness like a tool from a well-organized kit. He had explanations for the title discrepancy. He had an alternative reading of the authorization series. He spoke about clerical variations between regional offices with the confident fluency of a man who has spent considerable time preparing for exactly this challenge. He did not look at Eleanor directly. He had made a decision, apparently, to treat her account as something he was above engaging with, which Aldous did not allow him to maintain for very long. "Mrs. Mercer's account identifies 5 specific discrepancies," Aldous said. "I want your response to each one." Kane's jaw tightened by a degree that only Eleanor, watching carefully, would have caught. "With respect, Judge, the account of a frontier woman who claims to have read confidential documents through a bag buckle." "Answer the question, Mr. Kane." The title variation Kane could explain, after a fashion, poorly, but plausibly enough to survive as a single issue. The authorization series he could not. Eleanor had documented not 1, but 3 documents with the wrong prefix, and when Aldous pressed him on the specific coding system, Kane's answer developed gaps that widened under questioning. The Crowley Meridian transfer document he could not explain at all, because the question of how a private timber company owned by local settlers ended up named as the receiving entity in a territorial receivership order did not have an innocent answer, and everyone in the cabin knew it. It was Harlan Briggs who said what he needed to say, quietly, from the doorway. "Judge, the Crowley brothers approached Webb Harmon last November and offered to purchase his parcel at a fraction of its value. He declined. 3 months later, Kane arrived with the claim review." He paused. "That's worth knowing." Aldous wrote something in his ledger. He did not look up. "It is." Kane's 2 associates had stopped performing neutrality. They were looking at each other with the expressions of men doing rapid calculations about personal liability and arriving at uncomfortable sums. When Aldous finally looked up from the ledger, he looked at Kane for a long time. "I'm suspending all claim review proceedings initiated under your authority, effective immediately, pending a full territorial investigation." His voice was the same flat, even tone it had been for 2 hours. "You're not to leave the county while this investigation is active. The Crowley Meridian transfer documents are confiscated as potential evidence." He looked at Denton Crowley, who had come to stand in the doorway. "That goes for your company's records as well." Denton said something under his breath that Aldous chose not to hear, which was its own kind of statement. "Kane." Aldous waited until the man met his eyes. "If what Mrs. Mercer's account suggests is accurate, you will answer for it in territorial court. I'd recommend finding yourself competent legal representation in the immediate future." Kane stood. He straightened his coat with the careful deliberateness of a man maintaining dignity in the only direction still available to him. He looked, at last, at Eleanor. His face had shed the smoothness now. What was underneath it was not interesting, just the ordinary sourness of a man who'd built something on bad foundations and watched it come apart. He walked out without speaking. The cabin, after the door closed, let out a collective breath that was less like relief and more like the first real oxygen after a room had been sealed. The proceedings that followed played out over the next 6 weeks in the way that territorial legal matters played out, slowly, with paperwork, and with outcomes that satisfied almost nobody completely and most people adequately, which is the realistic definition of justice in a place where justice is being assembled from scratch. Kane's documents were examined by 2 territorial clerks who confirmed Eleanor's analysis in writing. The authorization series alone was sufficient to void all review proceedings. The discovery of Crowley Meridian as the designated transfer entity, combined with Harlan's account of the November approach to Webb Harmon, was sufficient to warrant criminal fraud charges against both Kane and Denton Crowley. Hugh Crowley, whose involvement was less documented and whose lawyer proved more agile, escaped formal charges but was required to appear before the investigating committee 3 times and emerged from the experience visibly diminished. Kane was removed from the territory pending trial. Denton Crowley was arrested in May by the county sheriff, not the deputy, who had indeed been enjoying the Crowley brothers' hospitality all winter and quietly stepped aside from the matter, and transported to the territorial seat. Webb Harmon's claim was formally confirmed. The Fisk brothers' eastern parcel boundary dispute, which had been quietly added to Kane's review list, was dismissed. Every frozen claim in the settlement was released. And Gideon's Upper Ridge parcel, the Highland Timber, the place where the pines grew so thick they blocked the midday sun, was confirmed under original settlement right, with Aldous personally signing the verification. Gideon held the paper for a long time when Harlan brought it up to the cabin. He stood at the porch and read it twice, and then folded it with a care that said more than anything he'd have put into words about what it meant. "She did that," Harlan told him, meaning Eleanor, meaning all of it. "I know," Gideon said. "You should tell her so." "I know that too," he said, and went back inside. The telling took longer because Gideon was who he was, and some things required time and the right conditions. The way certain plants won't flower until the temperature is exactly what they need. The right conditions arrived on a June evening when the Highland was warm for the first time since Eleanor had come to it. Genuinely warm, the kind of warmth that made the pines smell like something worth saving the memory of. Clara had been asleep since dusk, worn out from spending the entire day attempting to teach the cabin's resident cat a series of increasingly ambitious tricks that the cat declined to learn. Eleanor was on the porch, just sitting, which she almost never allowed herself because sitting felt like waste, and she had not yet fully unlearned the habit of making herself useful at every waking moment. Gideon came out and sat on the step below her, the new step, solid, not the rotted one she'd replaced in February, and looked at the tree line, and she looked at the tree line, and for a while there was just the sound of the pines in the evening wind, which was a sound she had grown to know the way you grow to know a person's voice. "I've been thinking," he said. "You do a lot of that." "Yes." He turned the statement over. "I've been thinking about what it cost you, coming here." She looked at the side of his face. "I didn't come here with a great deal to leave behind." "That's not what I mean." He was quiet for a moment. You came here and worked harder than I had any right to ask. You stayed when most people would have found a reason not to. You went back to a town that had been cruel to you and walked through it with your chin up and did what needed doing. He paused. And I haven't been good at saying, Gideon, let me finish. He looked at her. His face in the evening light was the same face it had been in Harlan's barn. Weathered, difficult, not given to easy expressions. But there was something in it now that she hadn't seen that first night. Something that had come uncovered over months of close living, the way a rock in a stream gets worn smooth, not from a single event, but from the constant patient work of water. I told you I didn't have sentiment in me. I think I believed that when I said it. She waited. I think what I meant was that I'd had it and lost it, and the losing was bad enough that I'd decided it was safer to say it was gone. He looked back at the tree line. It wasn't gone. I needed to see that it was worth the risk again. He stopped, started again, with the effortful honesty of a man who doesn't do this often, and is doing it anyway. You didn't fix anything, Eleanor. You didn't come in here and put things right and make everything better. That's not what happened. I know, she said quietly. What happened is... He exhaled. I watched you re-chink that wall with hands you'd never done it with before. I watched you split wood badly, and then less badly, and then well. I watched you hold my daughter the night she had the nightmare in March, and I watched her face change. He turned to her. You were here. That's what you did. You just stayed. And I can't tell you what that's worth to me because I don't have the language for what it's worth to me. Eleanor looked at him. There were things she could say. She could tell him that she'd stayed because Clara needed her to stay, which was true. She could tell him that she'd stayed because she had nowhere else to go, which had been true at the beginning and was no longer entirely accurate in the way that mattered. She could say something careful and measured that maintained a respectable distance from what she was actually feeling, which was what she had done for 30 years with every person who got close enough to be worth being careful with. She didn't do any of that. I know what it's worth, she said, because it's worth the same thing to me. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached over and put his hand over hers where it rested on the step beside her, and he left it there. Neither of them moved. The pines breathed in the evening wind. It wasn't a romantic moment in the way books described romantic moments. His hand was rough, and her hands were rough, and neither of them said anything else for a long time. But it was real in the way that the things that have been earned are real. Not easy, not decorated, just solid all the way through. She turned her hand over under his and held on. By summer, the settlement had begun the slow and somewhat awkward process of revising its opinion of Eleanor Mercer. It didn't happen cleanly or all at once, because human beings don't revise their opinions cleanly or all at once. They do it in stages and with the occasional backward step, and some of them never entirely get there. Ruth Alderman remained cool and would probably remain cool for the rest of her natural life. And Eleanor made her peace with that, in the same spirit she made her peace with the winter. You can't change the weather, you can only decide how to dress for it. But other things changed in ways that were real and worth naming. Webb Harmon came up to the cabin in late June with 2 of his sons and helped Gideon repair the north-facing section of the roof that had been a problem since before Eleanor arrived, and he worked alongside Gideon all day without saying much. And at the end of the day, he shook Gideon's hand and then turned to Eleanor and shook hers too, with a seriousness that said he understood what he was doing and meant it. The Fisk brothers sent a side of beef down in July, no note, no explanation, just the meat and a younger Fisk who shrugged when Eleanor tried to thank him and said his brothers said to bring it, so he'd brought it. Pete Calloway told anyone who would listen, which was most of Briar Ridge, since Pete had strong conversational instincts and no particular filter, that Eleanor Mercer had read those documents in a public room and then written an account that a territorial judge had called thorough and precise. And Pete said it with the pride of someone who'd always suspected there was more to Eleanor Vane than people gave credit for and was feeling vindicated on her behalf. Even Ada Colson, who had carried Ruth Alderman's doubts down the Highland Trail that winter afternoon, showed up one August morning with her youngest daughter, who had a dress that needed letting out, and asked Eleanor if she still had her sewing kit, which was, as Ada certainly knew, like asking a bear if it still had its claws. Eleanor took the dress, She sat with Ada's daughter and fitted the seams with the expertise of someone who'd been doing this since she was 12 years old, and Ada sat nearby and watched. And at some point during the second hour, Ada said, not quite looking at her, "I told people things last winter that I shouldn't have repeated." Eleanor kept her eyes on the seam. "I know. I'm not good at saying sorry. Harlan always tells me I'm terrible at it." "He's not wrong," Eleanor said, "but I appreciate it anyway." Ada laughed, which surprised both of them. It was a genuine laugh, the involuntary kind, and after it the room was easier. It wasn't forgiveness in the formal sense. Eleanor wasn't sure she believed in forgiveness as a formal transaction. She thought it was more like a decision you made about whether to keep carrying a thing, and sometimes you put it down and sometimes you didn't, and neither made you a saint or a monster. She put most of it down. Not all of it. She was human, not abstract. Clara turned 7 in September. They didn't make a large ceremony of it. Eleanor made a cake with dried apple and cinnamon because that was what Clara had requested with the specificity of a child who had been thinking about this for some time. And Harlan and Martha came up with their kids, and Pete Calloway came because Pete came to everything within riding distance. It was a small afternoon that filled the cabin with noise and flower dust and the sound of children arguing about nothing in particular and adults talking over each other. At some point during it, Eleanor was at the table cutting the cake, and Clara appeared at her elbow and watched her with those steady dark eyes. "Mama?" Clara said. Just," Clara leaned against her arm. "Nothing. Just wanted to say it." Eleanor looked down at her. This child who had crossed a room full of adults and changed everything by wanting something and not being ashamed of wanting it. This child who had known before anyone else that Eleanor was worth running toward. She put her arm around Clara's shoulders and pulled her in and pressed her cheek briefly to the top of Clara's head. And then she went back to cutting the cake because there were people waiting for it, and the moment didn't need to be stretched into something bigger than it was. It was already big enough. It was already everything. By the time the first snow came again to Iron Hollow, October this year, early and serious, the kind of snow that means business, the cabin was different from the one Eleanor had ridden toward in the dark 11 months before. The gaps in the chinking were filled and had stayed filled through the summer's expansion and contraction. The porch step was solid. The woodpile was stacked deep and organized by size, because Eleanor had opinions about woodpile organization that Gideon had stopped arguing with around March because she was right. There was a small kitchen garden along the south wall, mostly dead now, frost-killed. But it had produced through summer and would produce better next year because Eleanor had notes about what needed more sun and what the soil wanted that she'd been writing in the back of the account ledger all season. The inside walls had a different quality to them. Not clean, not pretty, still rough log and hard use, and the particular disorder of a household with a 7-year-old who treated every flat surface as a potential project surface. But there were small things. Clara's canvas samples pinned in a row above the fire, each one showing stitches progressively more even than the last. A new shelf, level this time, that Gideon had built in November with Eleanor standing next to him, saying that side, half an inch while he pretended to find this irritating and clearly did not. The carved box that had come in Eleanor's single bag was on that shelf, and she'd put things in it now. A bird feather Clara had brought her, a button she'd found in the trail mud that was too pretty to throw away, small objects that didn't mean anything to anyone else and meant something to her. One evening, early in that second winter, Eleanor sat by the fire and thought about Thomas Pruitt, the 8-year-old with his father's cruelty borrowed for the evening and the laughter that had caught and spread and unmade her in front of the people she'd sewn coats for and brought preserves to and smiled at. She thought about the version of herself who'd stood in that barn with a breath drawn and nowhere to put it. She didn't feel rage toward that room anymore. Not the hard kind, the kind that keeps you company at night and tells you that you were wronged, which was true, and that the wrong was the most important thing about you, which was not. She'd been wronged. She also had a daughter who called her name for the pleasure of saying it, and a husband who had covered her hand with his and meant something by it, and a mountain that didn't care who she was and required her to be capable regardless. And she had been capable. She was still being capable. It was ongoing. The truth she'd arrived at, slowly, without ceremony, the way you arrive at most truths worth having, was that she hadn't become someone new. She had become more thoroughly herself. The woman who walked into Harlan Briggs's barn with blueberry preserves and the careful invisibility of someone who'd learned to take up less space than she needed. That woman had been tougher than anyone there recognized, and the mountain had simply created conditions where the toughness could be seen. She hadn't needed to be remade. She'd needed room. The fire burned down and she let it, watching the coals. Behind her, she could hear Gideon moving in the back room, the creak of the bed as he lay down. Clara was already asleep, her breathing deep and steady. One arm flung out past the blanket in the unconscious confidence of a child who knows she's safe. Eleanor sat with the coals for a while longer. She thought about her father's office, the smell of ink and files. She thought about her mother's carved box, empty, because there was nothing to put in it. She thought about 30 years of being looked at, the way people look at things they've decided have a fixed and limited value, and she thought about how it felt to be wrong about the weather, to prepare for something that doesn't come, to find instead something you had no category for. She stood up. She banked the fire for the night, setting the damper, spreading the ash over the coals the way Gideon had shown her in December of the first winter. She checked the door. She checked Clara's blanket. She went to the back room and lay down in the dark, and after a moment Gideon, half asleep, moved to make room. Not because he'd thought about it, but because it had become what he did. The easy, unconscious accommodation of someone who has stopped imagining the space without you in it. She lay in the dark and listened to the snow beginning outside. The particular silence of it, the way it changed the sound of the wind and the pines and the world. Iron Hollow in winter. Hers. She closed her eyes.